The moment I saw the sheriff's cruiser kicking up dust near my barn, I knew exactly who had called it in. Only one person in the entire county had the audacity to report a working farm for suspicious activity: Cheryl Maddox, president of the Briar Ridge Homeowners Association and self-declared guardian of suburban perfection. I was elbow-deep in fixing a busted irrigation pump when I heard the tires crunching gravel. I turned, wiping the grease from my hands with an old rag, just in time to see Cheryl's bleach-blonde bob bouncing out of her Lexus SUV. Hands on hips, lips pursed like she'd swallowed a lemon. "This is not zoned agricultural," she snapped before even saying hello. "I've reported you for illegal livestock and unpermitted structures. There's a shed back there that wasn't on the original property plans." I stared at her, then at the chickens clucking behind her like they were in on the joke. "Cheryl, I own this land. It's not even in the HOA boundaries," I said. "You've been told this 10 times. It affects property values," she shouted back. "This is a residential community. Nobody wants to smell goats when they're drinking rose on their porch." I knew better than to argue with her logic. Cheryl ran the HOA like a Cold War dictator, fining people for mailbox colors and threatening legal action over garden gnomes. She'd already tried fining me even though my farm sat just outside the HOA lines. It didn't stop her from acting like she owned the whole zip code. That's when the deputy stepped out of his cruiser. But instead of heading toward me, he walked straight to Cheryl. "Ma'am, you called about suspicious activity here?" he asked. Cheryl folded her arms. "Yes, this man is running an illegal farm. There are animals, tools, even a greenhouse. He's violating the HOA guidelines, and I demand you inspect everything." I chuckled, shaking my head as I reached into my truck and pulled out my badge. "Actually," I said, flipping it open, "Detective Kellen North, County Sheriff's Office, Special Investigations. And you, Cheryl Maddox, are under arrest." Her face froze. "What? Arrest? For what?" I stepped forward, holding out the signed warrant. "Forgery, wire fraud, and impersonating public officials. We've been collecting complaints for months. You've been forging HOA documents and threatening residents with fake citations, sending fake legal letters, even altering zoning records to try and annex properties like mine." Her jaw dropped. Literally. I'd never seen a person's mouth hang so wide. "You're lying," she said, voice trembling now. "Nope. We've got witnesses, emails, and even recordings. You may have gotten away with bullying half the neighborhood, but you messed with the wrong guy when you came for my farm." As the deputy began reading her rights, Cheryl sputtered and tried to twist away. "You can't do this. I am the HOA." The deputy tightened the cuffs. "Not anymore, ma'am." Cheryl's designer heels sank into the soft dirt as the deputy led her around the side of the barn toward his cruiser. Her red handbag swung wildly while she hurled accusations at both of us. "This is harassment. Illegal detainment. I know the county commissioner personally, and you'll regret this." The deputy didn't even flinch. "You can explain all that to your attorney." I turned back toward the barn, my boots crunching over the gravel. I had no time to waste. The irrigation pump still needed fixing, and the goats were already getting restless. But I wasn't about to let this end quietly. Not after the months of digging, the interviews, the complaints, and the late nights poring over legal filings. Cheryl's arrest was only step one. Inside the barn, I grabbed the folder I kept in a locked cabinet behind the tool bench. Over 70 pages of documented evidence, notarized statements from residents, and a full timeline of her activities. I'd compiled it all with help from a county auditor who'd once caught Cheryl attempting to redirect HOA funds into a private landscaping company she secretly owned under a shell LLC. That little stunt had been buried under a mountain of paperwork until I found the smoking gun. A dated invoice with her maiden name on the wire transfer. As I flipped through the file to double-check the contents, my phone buzzed. Caller ID showed A. Rivas, my contact at the district attorney's office. "Kellen," she said without preamble. "We've got the green light. Judge signed off on the financial seizure order this morning. Maddox's accounts are frozen and the HOA's treasury is under audit. Perfect timing, I said, glancing out the barn window where Cheryl sat sulking in the back of the cruiser. There's more, Rivas said. We traced her compliance consultant payments. Turns out she funneled over $200,000 into a private account in Nevada. It's registered under a fake name, but the IP logs and the security footage from the bank match her face. I let out a slow breath. That's everything we need. Wire fraud, embezzlement, identity fraud, and abuse of authority. She's not just looking at county jail anymore. She'll be arraigned tomorrow morning, Rivas confirmed. We'll be pushing for no bail. She's got enough cash stashed to disappear. After I hung up, I walked out to the edge of the pasture. The sun was just beginning to dip, painting the sky in streaks of deep orange and violet. From the road, a few neighbors had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights and the rare sight of the HOA president being stuffed into a police car. Among them was Marcus, a retired Marine who'd lived in Briar Ridge for over 20 years. He'd once been fined $500 for building a wheelchair ramp without proper visual integration. Cheryl had claimed it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Marcus had to take out a second mortgage just to keep his house. I thought I'd never see the day, he said as I approached. You and me both, I replied. He glanced toward the cruiser. You sure she's going down for this? Absolutely. We've got bank records, fake citations, 2 forged signatures from city officials, and a concealed income source from a development company she was brokering deals with under the table. He shook his head. She was trying to buy those empty lots across from the park. Said she wanted to build a community center. But I heard she filed a rezoning request for multi-unit condos. She did, under a fake nonprofit. We traced the N back to her niece in Tampa. Marcus whistled low. No wonder she wanted to push everyone out who didn't fit the image. She needed the land. She nearly got away with it, I said, watching the cruiser pull away. But she made one mistake. What's that? She called 911 on a cop's farm. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. Local news vans parked along the road. Reporters buzzed around the gates of Briar Ridge, interviewing residents who were finally, after years of silent frustration, ready to talk. One by one, stories came out. A widowed schoolteacher who'd been threatened with foreclosure over a missing fence slat. A young couple fined repeatedly for unauthorized holiday decor because their menorah didn't match the Christmas-themed guidelines. A disabled vet forced to remove his PTSD service garden because it exceeded the approved color palette. Each story painted a clearer picture. Cheryl had weaponized the HOA charter, turning it into a personal fiefdom. And she'd backed her threats with letters bearing forged signatures from city inspectors and fake legal notices that mimicked official county stationery right down to the font. I met with the county attorney's team later that afternoon. The case had grown fast. What started as a local corruption issue was now moving toward a full-blown racketeering investigation. 3 other board members were under scrutiny for potential kickbacks. One of them, a smug accountant named Harris, had already lawyered up. He'd approved every one of Cheryl's community improvement budgets, none of which had ever been put to a vote. We're building a RICO case, the county's lead investigator told me. You opened the door. Now we're walking through it. I handed over the last piece of the puzzle, a flash drive with audio recordings from a planning meeting Cheryl held in secret at a country club 30 miles away. She bragged about how easy it was to manipulate scared homeowners and make profit off their ignorance. She laughed about using fines as leverage to force sales, then flipping the homes through a shell buyer. It was damning. That evening, I stood at the edge of the neighborhood park where over 50 residents had gathered. No one had called them there. They came on their own, drawn by the same mix of relief and disbelief that had filled me since the moment I slapped the warrant into Cheryl's manicured hands. A woman stepped forward, Ava, one of the few single moms in the neighborhood who'd been repeatedly harassed about her son's basketball hoop. I don't know what you did, she said, but you gave us our neighborhood back. I didn't say much, just nodded. then turned toward the old HOA office, the small stucco building Cheryl had insisted be built with association funds, complete with marble floors and a fingerprint scanner on the door. The county had already sealed it off. A notice posted on the door read, "Under investigation. No entry without authorization." As the crowd looked on, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small brass key the Master Cheryl had once flaunted like a badge of honor. I held it up, then tossed it into a plastic evidence bag and sealed it shut. "Time to elect a new board," I said. The cheer that followed wasn't loud. It was steady, determined, like a community waking up after a long sleep, finally ready to rebuild on their own terms. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, though the air conditioning was humming, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that settles in when people realize they've been living under a lie. The gallery held a quiet tension, packed with residents from Briar Ridge, all sitting with folded arms and narrowed eyes. No one was here for curiosity. They were here for reckoning. Cheryl Maddox sat at the defense table in a charcoal pantsuit that tried too hard to scream, composed. It didn't work. Her hands trembled as she gripped a glass of water, and every few seconds she glanced toward the doors like she expected anyone to walk in and declare this all one big misunderstanding. But no one came. No husband, no friends, no board members. The ones who hadn't already flipped were too busy protecting their own necks. The judge, a man with a stern jaw and a reputation for cutting through theatrics, adjusted his glasses as the prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit evidence from the county assessor's office emails in which the defendant attempted to falsify the ownership status of 2 adjoining properties by submitting altered plat maps. The properties in question were never under HOA jurisdiction but were targeted for annexation by the defendant." "Admitted," the judge said, barely glancing up. Cheryl leaned toward her attorney, whispering frantically. He didn't look thrilled. He had been court-appointed after she was denied bail and couldn't access the accounts she'd set up in other people's names. Those were frozen, and the funds inside were under forensic audit. Ava sat beside me, arms crossed. She leaned over and whispered, "She's going to try to cut a deal." "Look at her." "She already tried," I replied without looking away. "They offered her 6 years and full restitution. She refused." The prosecutor continued, now moving to the recordings I'd gathered, the ones from the off-site meetings at the private club where Cheryl had laid out her plans like a real estate mogul. "Here, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, tapping the playback remote, "is the defendant openly describing how she manipulated property sales by issuing escalating code violations. She refers to residents as low-hanging fruit and describes her strategy as squeeze, scare, sell." The courtroom listened in silence as Cheryl's voice filled the room, smug and self-assured, on tape. "I send 3 letters, throw in a lien threat, and they're begging to sell. Then I just have my buyer sweep in. Boom, 20% under market. Easy money." The judge's brow furrowed. Cheryl shrank into her seat. After the recording ended, the judge turned to the defense table. "Miss Maddox, do you still wish to proceed to trial?" Her attorney stood. "Your Honor, we'd like a brief recess to confer." The judge nodded once. 15 minutes. Don't waste my time." Outside the courtroom, I stepped into the hallway where a few more residents waited, unable to find seats inside. Marcus stood by the vending machines, arms loose at his sides, but his expression tight. "She really said that? Squeeze, scare, sell?" "Word for word," I said. He stared at the floor. "I had to sell my buddy's old place for him last year. He was dying of cancer. Cheryl fined him for weeds he physically couldn't pull. She said the HOA wasn't responsible for personal health challenges. He sold to one of her shell buyers." I nodded. "We found 34 properties like that. Same buyer, same process. All flipped in under 90 days at a profit. She used the equity to fund her nonprofit facade." He looked up. "What's the DA going to do with that?" "They're filing an amendment under elder financial abuse statutes. She's not just going down for fraud anymore. They're building a case for exploitation of vulnerable adults." His mouth tightened, but he didn't speak. Just nodded once, then turned back toward the courtroom. The 15 minutes passed quickly. When we re-entered, Cheryl was already seated. Her lawyer stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client is now willing to accept the plea deal. She understands the charges and is prepared to make a full confession." The judge's gaze didn't soften. "Let the record show that the defendant pleads guilty to 27 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of forgery, 6 counts of criminal misrepresentation, and 1 count of aggravated elder exploitation. Sentencing will be scheduled in 60 days. Bail remains denied." Cheryl didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her jaw clenched. As the hearing ended and the bailiff led her away, someone in the gallery stood. It was an older man with a cane and a Veterans of Foreign Wars pin on his lapel. "Tell the rest of your board," he called after her. "We're done being pushed around." No one stopped him. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Cheryl didn't turn. Later that week, the county held a town hall in Briar Ridge's community center, not the marble-floored monument Cheryl built, but the original rec hall by the lake, the one the community had used before she declared it a liability and had it shut down. The room was packed. Every folding chair was taken. People stood along the walls and even spilled out onto the lawn. A temporary panel of interim board members, all volunteers, sat at the front. I stood in the back by the exit, content to observe. The new treasurer, a former CPA named Eleanor with a no-nonsense tone, stepped up to the mic. "We've completed the financial audit," she began. "Of the last 5 years' budgets, nearly $500,000 was misappropriated. We're working with county officials to get restitution through asset forfeiture. The properties Cheryl bought under shell companies are being seized and will be auctioned. Proceeds will go toward repaying victims." A murmur ran through the crowd. "We're also restructuring the charter," Eleanor continued. "From now on, no single person can serve more than 2 years on the board. All enforcement actions will require a majority vote, and we're banning private legal notices. Everything goes through the county clerk now." Someone in the crowd asked, "What about the people who lost their homes?" "We're working with legal aid to see if any of the sales can be challenged. It's complicated, but we're trying." The room quieted again. Then a woman near the front stood up. She was in her 30s, holding a toddler on her hip. "I've lived here 5 years, she said. "When Cheryl sent me 3 violations in 1 week for inappropriate yard tools, I thought I was just unlucky. I had no idea she was targeting us. Thank you for digging, for not letting it go." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. This wasn't about me anymore. As the meeting ended, I stepped outside for some air. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the grass. The lake shimmered, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Eleanor walked out a moment later and joined me by the railing. "We're thinking of renaming the HOA," she said. "Start fresh. Something honest." "Good idea," I said. She hesitated. "You know, some of us were scared to talk." She made it feel like we'd lose everything if we did. "She counted on fear," I said. "That's how people like her operate." Eleanor nodded. "Well, not anymore." As she walked away, I looked back at the old community center. Its wooden siding needed repainting, and the roof sagged a little, but people were smiling as they left. Neighbors shook hands, shared laughs, made plans. For the first time in a long while, Briar Ridge felt like a neighborhood again. And Cheryl Maddox? She'd be trading her marble floors for concrete and stainless steel. The only board she'd be facing from now on was parole. The sentencing hearing drew a bigger crowd than the town hall. The courthouse parking lot was full by 8 in the morning, and the line to get through security wrapped around the side of the building. I arrived early. Not because I needed to be there officially, the DA's office had everything they needed, but because I wanted to see it through. I wasn't the only one. By the time I took my seat, the gallery was already filled with familiar faces. People who had been fined, harassed, or pressured into silence were now watching the final act. No one spoke. No one had to. The quiet was heavier than any verdict. The bailiff called the court to order. Cheryl walked in under escort, wearing the same expressionless mask she'd worn during every appearance since her arrest. She sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. Her hair was darker now, tied back in a low bun, and the designer clothes had been replaced by a plain navy blazer courtesy of the county detention wardrobe. Her attorney rose and addressed the court first. "Your Honor, the defendant is prepared to accept full responsibility for her actions. She understands the impact her conduct has had on this community and wishes to express sincere remorse. We request leniency in sentencing due to her cooperation and voluntary confession." The judge didn't respond immediately. He turned a page in his notes, then looked out over the gallery. "I've reviewed the record," he began. "I've read every victim impact statement. I've consulted with the Financial Crimes Unit, the Elder Affairs Department, and the Zoning Commission. This case is not simply about mismanagement, nor is it a matter of poor judgment." He turned his gaze back to Cheryl. "You ran a sustained and deliberate campaign to exploit fear, manipulate legal authority, and extract wealth from those least able to defend themselves. You faked signatures. You altered public records. You misrepresented your legal authority to pressure homeowners into surrendering their property. Your actions were systematic, intentional, and devastating." He paused, then continued. "You didn't just break the law. You broke trust, and you did it not out of desperation, but for profit." Cheryl didn't flinch. Her attorney placed a hand on the table, but she didn't look at him. "In light of the scope of the offense," the judge said, "and the measurable harm inflicted on over 40 individuals, including elderly residents, disabled veterans, and single-parent households, this court finds no grounds for leniency." He delivered the sentence without hesitation. 24 years in state prison with eligibility for supervised release after 18. Full restitution to be paid from seized assets. Lifetime ban from serving on any corporate or nonprofit board and permanent revocation of notary and executor privileges. A murmur ran through the courtroom, but no one interrupted. The bailiff approached Cheryl. She stood slowly, her eyes scanning the room for something: recognition, sympathy, perhaps just a trace of the influence she once wielded. She found none. As she was escorted out, the judge addressed the crowd. "This case has revealed vulnerabilities in the way local governance can be abused. Let it serve as a warning and a reminder: power without oversight is a threat to all." The courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the air was crisp and clear. I walked down the steps and found Eleanor waiting by the sidewalk, holding a thick envelope under one arm. "They're releasing the last of the audit materials to the committee," she said. "It's worse than we thought." She was coordinating with 2 developers in neighboring counties, tried to get them to fund a fabricated beautification initiative. They were going to push through a private rezoning appeal under the table. I raised an eyebrow. "County planning catch it?" "Barely." One of the developers flipped after the subpoena hit. She handed me the envelope. "You might want to see this. It includes a memo she wrote to one of the board members. She called your farm the final holdout and said once she got you removed, the rest would fall in line." I took the envelope and nodded. "Doesn't surprise me. You were the only property she couldn't touch. That made you a threat." "Which is exactly why she called the sheriff's office," I said. "She wasn't trying to enforce anything. She was trying to provoke a legal event she could spin into leverage." "You think she thought you'd snap?" "Would have played perfectly into her hands. One angry farmer resisting community standards. She could have used that to rally the rest of the board and justify annexation." Eleanor shook her head. "You played it right. Patient. Methodical. You let her walk right into her own mess. She built the trap. I just waited until she stepped in it." That evening I returned to the farm. The barn was quiet, the animals settled, and the air carried the scent of fresh hay and damp earth. The irrigation pump I'd repaired weeks ago was still humming steadily, the line running clean and full through the field. I stepped into the barn office and placed the audit documents in the lockbox beside the original evidence files. I didn't need them anymore, but something in me couldn't throw them away. They weren't just paperwork, they were proof. Proof that no matter how slick the operation, how loud the bully, or how long the abuse, someone could always stand up and say no. The next morning, I was back at the county offices, this time wearing a different badge. My official reassignment papers had come through. I wasn't going back to investigations. I'd taken a new position, Community Oversight Liaison. My job was simple. Work with neighborhoods, associations, and local agencies to identify signs of overreach and prevent the kind of system Cheryl had built from ever taking root again. As I stepped into the briefing room for orientation, I found a familiar face sitting at the conference table. Marcus. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said. He grinned. "They asked for volunteers to sit on the new advisory board. Figured I'd give it a shot. Thought maybe people like us should be watching the watchers." I laughed. That's exactly the idea. The months that followed brought quiet change. The properties Cheryl had flipped were returned to the market under court supervision, with proceeds redirected to victims. Several homeowners who'd been forced out were offered settlements, and a few even returned. One of them, an elderly man named Joel, was welcomed back with a block-wide potluck and a fresh coat of paint on his house, courtesy of volunteers. Briar Ridge began to feel more like a neighborhood than a managed investment. The new board operated transparently, held open meetings, and even created a rotating seat reserved for non-board residents. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. One afternoon, I walked the edge of the property line where Cheryl had once tried to file a fraudulent annexation claim. I planted a new sign in the ground, a small, hand-painted wooden marker that read, "Private land. Protected and free." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I leaned against the fence, watching the goats wander through the pasture, their hooves stirring little tufts of grass and soil. Behind me, the community was rebuilding, not under fear, not under threat, but by choice. And in the distance, the marble-floored monument to Cheryl's ego had been shuttered and sold. A local youth program had bought it at auction, stripped out the luxury fixtures, and reopened it as a community learning center. Where once there had been silence, there was now laughter, debate, and music. Justice didn't always come in flashing lights and courtrooms. Sometimes it came in the steady rhythm of reclaimed land, the quiet dignity of neighbors standing tall, and the knowledge that power, no matter how tightly gripped, was never above the people it sought to control.